Well, as America approaches its annual day of celebrating our independence, it is worth emphasizing that this is not Donald Trump's America. The president does sometimes try to behave like a king. He tries to behave like he owns the place. But what we are celebrating tomorrow is independence from a king. And there is no figurative or poetic sense in which this is Donald Trump's America. The picture that new polling presents is largely a country that opposes President Trump. A new Quinnipiac poll tonight shows that 55% of Americans disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing as president. And some of that disapproval is now coming from Republican senators, finally, which we will get to in a moment. But there's another unique entry in this new Trump poll. It is an achievement that belongs to Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone in the history of Quinnipiac polls, in the history of all presidential polls. Donald Trump has won the highest number of people in the history of presidential polling who say the President of the United States is a racist. In the new Quinnipiac poll, 49% of voters say the president is a racist. 47% say they don't think he is. In the history of presidential polling, no one is a close second to Donald Trump on the racist question. In fact, as far as we've been able to find in our research about polling today, there's no one in second place, because the question has never been asked in polling about any other president. The racism of Donald Trump, as perceived by half of the country, is not what is bothering Republican senators about Donald Trump. Some of them are making comments about the president unlike anything they have ever said. Consider the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch. And remember that Orrin Hatch is the senator who said this about Donald Trump.
We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to make this the greatest presidency that we've seen, not only in generations, but maybe ever.
So the only member of Congress, and possibly the only American not named Trump, who has said that Donald Trump could be the best president ever, is now saying something that doesn't sound like Orrin Hatch at all. I actually don't recognize the current Trump-supporting version of Orrin Hatch. The Orrin Hatch who I knew and saw virtually every day when I was working on the Senate Finance Committee in the 1990s was one of the reasonable and sometimes cooperative and compromising Republicans on the committee who helped get the committee's work done, especially on matters of international trade. And Orrin Hatch has always been the quintessential representative of mild-mannered Utah politeness in the United States Senate. So imagine my shock when I read Orrin Hatch saying, "I'd like to kill him," in Politico. Orrin Hatch would like to kill the Trump tariffs. According to Politico, Republican senators say they can't get the president to comprehend that his tariffs offensive could damage the American economy. And so there is a rebellion brewing among Republican senators on the Trump tariffs. And this could be the thing that pushes Donald Trump's disapproval rating even higher. According to the Des Moines Register, Iowa soybean farmers could lose up to $624 million in export revenue because of retaliatory tariffs on soybeans. Iowa's junior senator, Republican Joni Ernst, told Politico, "We want to support the president. My constituents want to support the president as well, but they can only keep that stiff upper lip before things collapse. We're not quite at that point, but it's rapidly approaching." So the new definition of representing your state as a Republican in the United States Senate seems to be stick with Donald Trump until your state collapses. Joni Ernst apparently has no intention of abandoning the president before the collapse of Iowa. She seems to be saying she will have to see the complete collapse of the farm economy in Iowa for her to abandon the president. Donald Trump came in second in the Iowa caucuses at the beginning of the presidential campaign. If he keeps up his trade war with the world, Donald Trump just might find a way to come in second in the Iowa caucuses again in 2020. Leading off our discussion now, Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. He was a Chief Economist and Economic Policy Advisor to Vice President Biden. Also with us, Neera Tanden, President of the Center for American Progress. She was Hillary Clinton's Policy Director during the 2008 presidential campaign. And John Harwood is with us. He's the Editor-at-Large for CNBC. And John Harwood, I wanted to start with you because the Commerce Secretary said on CNBC that there is no drop in the stock market dramatic enough. There's no way any of the changes in the stock market that we're seeing could possibly affect the president's commitment to his tariffs, but we must stipulate that he is only the Secretary of Commerce, which means he, like the rest of us, has no idea what Donald Trump's going to do tomorrow on tariffs.
Well, and Donald Trump may have no idea what Donald Trump's going to do tomorrow on tariffs. This is somebody who does not have a firm grasp of policy issues, of the implications of his policies. He acts on gut instinct and impulse, and he has had anti-free trade impulses for quite a long time. But this is deeply irrational from the standpoint of somebody who's leading a country, who wants to have a strong economy, who wants to protect his constituents, who wants to get reelected, because of the damage in the Midwest. If he goes ahead with the national security-linked auto tariffs he's talking about, the agricultural Midwest, Iowa and other places, if he sticks with this tariff war, it makes no sense economically, and it's also counterproductive politically. Nevertheless, the president's doing it, and it makes you wonder, is he actually acting rationally while doing this? We don't know.
And Neera Tanden, the president's statements on trade were not very specific during the campaign. It was all about just ripping up NAFTA and getting rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, just getting rid of these agreements that are kind of large and complex agreements. But he never really said what he would do in its place. He never went around the country campaigning saying, I am going to impose through tariffs what are, in effect, massive sales taxes on American consumers who buy anything made outside of the United States.
And he also didn't say, I'm going to threaten the jobs of lots of farmers and lots of manufacturers. The reality of what we're dealing with Donald Trump is, for some reason that's really hard to fathom, he's decided to go to and have a trade war with our closest allies, Canada, Europe. He's essentially, and at the same time, hurting Americans. And I have to just state this, his health care bill went after rural white voters in places like Iowa and the Midwest, throughout the South. Now his trade policies are targeting farmers. Lots of manufacturers throughout the country, nail producers, are going out of business. It's as if he's taking a wrecking ball to the lives and fortunes of the people who actually just voted for him, and really testing essentially how much of a lemming they're going to be in support of him as much as he hurts them.
Jared Bernstein, it seems the president has discovered that he has a power that he can use without consulting anyone. He discovered that in the pardon power to his delight, which seems to be what he likes most about pardons, as well as possibly signaling future criminal defendants who are friends of his that they might be getting pardons. But he found the loophole, his staff found the loophole in American trade law in Section 232 that allows the president to impose tariffs only as a matter of national security, and none of the tariffs that the president has imposed or announced his intention to impose actually involve national security. And so at a certain point, the Republicans in the Senate, who have always objected to this kind of thing, are finally beginning to find their voices, but their voices at this point seem to be whispering.
Yeah, I agree with you. Canada is not a security threat. Neither is the European Union. And in fact, if anything, the president seems to embrace leaders who are threats and go after ones who aren't. Look, The Senate has long folded, conservatives and Republicans, in the face of Trumpian chaos, even when it comes to matters of the well-being of their own constituents. You know, we used to say in Washington, follow the money. Well, follow the soybeans right now, because a lot of farmers' income is at stake. And, you know, Donald Trump said he doesn't like all those German cars on the street. That's what motivated his potential auto tariffs. Well, do you know where the biggest BMW factory is in the world? It's in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And by the way, American auto producers, Ford, Chrysler, GM, uniformly oppose auto tariffs. Why? You think it would help their competitiveness? Because every single car on the road now, including the ones that American producers build, has lots of foreign imports. And if their price of every one of them goes up 20%, that's going to be a cost they're going to have to pass on to consumers. It's chaotic, destructive policy that is not going to help people who've been hurt by trade. People who really need help, by the way, it's going to hurt them.
And Lawrence,
And go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, it may be that President Trump in this situation cares more about trying to exert his personal dominance over another leader than he does about the fate of his own constituents and their economic well-being. He loves to engage on a personal basis. He makes decisions based on how he feels about someone personally, and we've seen with Justin Trudeau that he has tried to, in effect, say, I'm bigger than you. He's done the same thing with Angela Merkel, Theresa May. He may be trying to use this power that he possesses uniquely with a justification, even if it's bogus, to try to assert that he can dominate them.
See, the only thing
go ahead, Nir.
I would just quickly add, what's crazy about this situation is Donald Trump himself is basically hurting soybean manufacturers, soybean farmers, manufacturers throughout this country, lots of people, lots of Americans who are struggling to get by, while at the same time basically doing ads for China's ZTE, which is just, you know, I've never heard or seen anything like it, where an American president is hurting American companies and workers and basically helping a Chinese company.
Yeah. The one thing I would add,
And Jared,
oh, sure, go ahead. So the one thing I would add is that we actually have a pretty good-looking macroeconomy right now. The unemployment rate is low. Growth rates are pretty stable. And the best thing I can say about the Trump contribution to the economy is he hasn't screwed it up yet, but he seems to be trying pretty hard to do so.
John, I was going to point out, I'm glad Nira brought up ZTE, because ZTE is the only issue that anyone in Washington has looked at and said there are some national security concerns with that. Most of China trade involves absolutely no security concerns whatsoever. And so the Trump tariffs are illegal by our own definition because they do not meet the national security standard. They do violate the World Trade Organization's own definitions of correct use of tariffs. But there has been astonishing support for this seizure, this presidential seizure of congressional power, astonishing support from Democrats. Chuck Schumer actually said in regards to the China tariffs, President Trump is right on target. That was Chuck Schumer's reaction to it. And last week, when some Republicans were trying to get an amendment going on the agriculture bill to restrict the president's power to increase tariffs through this loophole, Sherrod Brown, Democrat, stood up and opposed and blocked that amendment. That was an amendment to limit Donald Trump's illegal use of presidential power, and that illegal use of presidential power was supported on the Senate floor by Democrats.
Well, look, a lot of people want to get tough with China, and China is the legitimate bad actor in international trade that we have big grievances in. Their theft of intellectual property, the restrictions they place on American investment in China. And that's what makes the ZTE case that you mentioned so striking. It's a real national security case. He's gone the other way. And because of the other extraordinary feature of Trump's presidency, that is, he continues to make money as president with his businesses, although he's not managing them overseas. And so the Chinese government's lending $500 million to a Trump project in Indonesia. Dozens of trademarks have been granted to Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump business initiatives in China. Is that why he is supporting ZTE? It's difficult to figure that out. Nobody really knows the answer, but it's certainly something that goes diametrically against the national security interests of the United States when he is erroneously citing them in other areas.
I mean, at the end
Neera,
of the day, go ahead.
I just want to get your political reaction to Democrats on the Senate floor like Sherrod Brown, also Chuck Schumer, supporting the president in what is clearly an illegal use of the national security loophole in trade law and supporting President Trump in a seizure of what is supposed to be Senate and congressional power.
Look, I think anyone who supports Donald Trump's illegal use of the rules, the things he's doing to basically affirm his agenda at the expense of real national security threats like ZTE itself, Democrats should not do that. And I appreciate in a lot of parts of the country, trade is a hard issue. And John Harwood is absolutely right. Trade with China is a much more legitimate issue than a phony trade war with Canada or Europe. And when the president has a phony trade war and has phony national security reasons for a trade war with our closest allies, Democrats should stand up to that. But I think what's also really important is, we have to ensure that we at some point get some investigatory power, because at this point we have a president who has a trade policy that hurts Americans and helps his own pocketbook. And that we have at least reasons to ask questions about that. And because the Republicans won't do any investigations, Americans don't really know at the end of the day whether the ZTE deal or other things Trump is doing is actually helping himself at the expense of voters.
Jared Bernstein, the American government has done very well in the World Trade Organization when it comes to trade disputes. It wins almost all of them. And it's always prosecuting these trade disputes against countries that are violating the rules. Now the United States of America is violating the rules in a grander, more open way than we have ever seen any other country do. There have been, when other countries try to violate the rules, they try to do it secretly. Here is the President of the United States doing it publicly. What does that do to America's position in the World Trade Organization going forward?
Well, I think it makes it obviously extremely difficult for us to argue for a rules-based system of international trading. And it's that very system that Trump's chaos is throwing a wrench into. And by the way, as I've tried to stress in earlier comments, there are definitely Americans who have been hurt by the fact that we've run large trade deficits for many years. And Donald Trump connected with those people during the campaign. They voted for him. Now he's hurting them. When it comes to the WTO, however, looking tough, disobeying, dismissing the WTO for Donald Trump is a feature, not a bug. He views the WTO as an anarchic organization that has no more relevance in his kind of make it up as you go along trade regime. And so I think what the problem ends up being at the end of the day is that initially everybody thought he was just bloviating. I'm talking about our trading partners. Then they started to talk about retaliation. Now they're moving into a mode of really fighting back tough. And so I think the problem of retaliation to these measures is enough to really shave some significant growth off the U.S. economy if we keep going down the same path we're going on. We really haven't seen that yet. But if Donald Trump gets his way with a trade war of the magnitude that I fear he's seeking, we're all going to feel it in our pocketbooks.
That'll have to be the end of the first round. Jared Bernstein, Neera Tanden, and John Harwood, thank you for joining us at the beginning here tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.